The small house sat at the edge of town, its paint fading, its porch creaking like old bones. Inside, Mary moved slowly from room to room, her steps careful, her breath steady, but tired. Once, these same rooms had been filled with laughter, the smell of food, the echo of small feet running across the floor. Now, only silence lived there. She paused by the kitchen doorway, resting her hand on the table. It was the same table where her children had once gathered, where she had cut birthday cakes, bandaged scraped knees, and listened to teenage worries late into the night. How strange, she thought, that something so solid could hold so many ghosts. The air carried the faint scent of lavender, her own doing, an attempt to make the emptiness feel less cruel. But the scent only reminded her that no one came to visit, no one to notice the little things she still cared for. She had become invisible inside the home she once built with her whole life. Every sound she made, a plate set down, a sigh, the shuffle of her slippers, seemed to echo back to her like a voice of memory. She sometimes spoke aloud just to break the stillness, saying things like "dinner's ready" or "it's getting cold," even though no one answered. It wasn't madness that made her speak that way. It was longing, the kind of longing that lingers when love has nowhere left to go. The last time her eldest son came to visit, the house had looked brighter. She had prepared his favorite soup, cleaned the living room twice, and set the table as if it were a holiday. When she heard his car in the driveway, her heart leapt like it hadn't in years. But the visit was short. His voice was gentle but rushed. He spoke of work, of the children's schedules, of how things were busy. He smiled when she asked about his wife, yet his eyes darted toward his phone every few minutes. She tried to tell him about her garden, about how the rose bush had bloomed again. But he nodded absently, his mind elsewhere. When he finally stood to leave, he kissed her cheek, saying, "Take care of yourself, Mom. I'll call soon." She smiled as mothers do, the kind of smile that hides 1,000 unspoken aches. After he left, the house grew silent again, as if even the walls had stopped breathing. The bowl of soup sat untouched. She let it cool completely, before covering it and placing it in the refrigerator. Later, when she sat at the table alone, she whispered softly, "You were here. That's enough." But the words broke halfway through, and her heart knew it wasn't enough. On the old wooden shelf above her fireplace, dozens of framed photographs told the story of a life once full. Her children as babies, their birthdays, graduations, weddings. Each picture seemed alive with color, bright moments frozen against the slow fading of time. Mary would sit in her armchair and look at them one by one, tracing the outlines with her eyes. Sometimes she spoke to the images, recalling the stories behind each smile. "You cried that day," she'd say softly to her daughter's picture. "But then you laughed again when I wiped your tears." The house might have been empty, but these photographs filled it with ghosts of laughter and echoes of the past. The smiles on the walls reminded her of who she had been, the mother who stayed up late to sew costumes, who prayed over sleeping children, who held her husband's hand through years of quiet faith. But now she wondered if they remembered. Did they think of her when they passed by their own photos? Did her voice ever drift into their minds when they tucked in their own children at night? Sometimes she would take one photo down, hold it close, and whisper, "You used to call me every Sunday." And though her lips smiled faintly, her eyes betrayed the truth. The memory of love was both her comfort and her torment. There were pains in Mary's body, the dull ache in her knees, the stiffness in her hands, but none of them compared to the ache that lived quietly in her chest. It was not the kind of pain that medicine could touch. It was the silent ache of rejection. The slow realization that love once returned had grown distant. She never spoke of it to anyone. When neighbors asked how her children were, she smiled and said, "Busy, as always." She defended them gently, even when her heart wanted to cry. "They have their own lives," she'd add, as though explaining her solitude to herself more than to others. At night, when the lights were off and the world had gone still, the truth pressed down on her, not as anger but as sorrow. She didn't want to blame them. She only wished they had seen her, not as a burden or a duty, but as their mother. There were moments she almost called them, phone in hand, fingers trembling over the numbers. But fear held her back, fear of interrupting, fear of hearing impatience on the other end. So instead, she prayed, always prayed. And though her voice often trembled, she kept whispering their names to heaven, one by one, hoping that love might travel farther upward than it could across the distance between their homes and hers. Evenings arrived gently in Mary's small town, the sky fading into a soft violet hue, the wind cooling, the world preparing to rest. But for her, the night was not rest. It was remembering. She would sit by the window as the first stars appeared, holding a worn shawl around her shoulders. The house would darken slowly, room by room, until only the dim glow of her lamp remained. Outside, she could see other homes with lights flickering, families laughing around dinner tables. She imagined their conversations, the warmth of voices overlapping, the clinking of dishes. Inside her own house, silence thickened. It wasn't empty silence. It was full of what once was. She could almost hear the echo of her children running down the hallway, calling her name. Sometimes the memory was so vivid that she turned her head, half expecting to see them standing there, but there was only stillness. She often whispered their names as she looked at the stars. Daniel, Sarah, Michael. Her lips trembled as she spoke them aloud, as if saying them might summon them home. But no voices answered, only the faint sound of wind brushing against the glass, like heaven breathing close, but not yet speaking. Every night she tried to pray before bed. Some nights she succeeded. Other nights she simply sat in her chair, her Bible resting unopened on her lap, her heart too heavy for words. Mary's prayers had become quieter through the years. There was no longer the strong, confident tone she once had when her faith felt simple. Now her voice was small, trembling, uncertain. "Lord," she whispered one night, "was I not good enough? Did I love them the wrong way?" Her words faltered as tears began to fall, soaking the edge of her pillow. She thought of all the times she had chosen sacrifice, skipping meals to feed her children, sewing their clothes by candlelight, working extra hours when her husband grew ill. Every choice, every effort had been made out of love. Yet now, love seemed to have forgotten its way back to her. "Maybe I talked too much. Maybe I expected too much," she murmured, her heart aching with questions that found no answer. "But Lord, I only wanted to be loved the way I loved them." Her breathing slowed as exhaustion overtook her. The room grew quiet again. She fell asleep with her hands still clasped, her whispered prayer lingering softly in the air, unanswered, yet heard. And though she didn't know it, heaven had bent low that night, listening to every trembling word. Days passed. Her prayers did not stop, but the silence that followed them began to feel endless. She sometimes wondered if God, too, had forgotten her name. She attended church when she could, sitting quietly in the last pew, watching families gather together, sons helping mothers to their seats, daughters holding their fathers' hands. The sight was both beautiful and unbearable. After each service, she returned home to her empty kitchen, the sound of her cane tapping softly against the tiles. She would set down her purse, boil water for tea, and whisper to herself, "Maybe next Sunday." The silence seemed cruel, but it had its own kind of depth. It was as though God was not speaking but waiting, letting her emptiness create a space large enough for something holy to fill. On one particularly quiet night, she stared at the ceiling and said softly, "If you are still there, Lord, please just let me hear you once more, just once." Her eyes closed, the silence remained. But somewhere deep within that stillness, something unseen began to stir, faintly, quietly, like the breath before a whisper. It happened in the early hours of morning, when darkness and dawn still held hands. Mary woke suddenly, not from pain, but from a presence, something soft and gentle that filled the room. At first, she thought it was the wind again, brushing through the cracks of the window. But then she heard it, not with her ears, but with her soul. A whisper, delicate and unmistakable. "Mary." Her breath caught. It wasn't frightening. It was familiar, like a name spoken by someone who had known her since the beginning of time. The sound, or rather the feeling, carried warmth, tenderness, and something deeper still, belonging. Tears welled in her eyes before she even understood why. For years, she had spoken into silence. Now, silence was speaking back. "Who's there?" she whispered into the dimness. But in her heart, she already knew. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't her imagination, it was the voice she had been waiting for all her life, the one that called her long before her children ever spoke her name. The second time she heard it, the sound was even softer, almost like a memory breathed back into life. Mary. It wasn't loud, nor did it come from any direction. It was within her, as though her very soul had remembered how to listen. She sat up slowly, her frail hands clutching the blanket, her heart pounding with a mix of awe and disbelief. The air around her felt still, yet alive, as if the world itself was holding its breath. For the first time in years, the emptiness of her home didn't feel empty. The silence had changed. It was now full of something sacred, something that saw her. Her tears came quietly. She had spent so many nights calling for her children, waiting for a voice, for a word, for any sign that she was not forgotten. And now, this whisper, so gentle, so personal, pierced deeper than any cry could reach. She whispered back, her voice trembling, "I'm here, Lord." And though no reply followed, she felt the warmth of presence settle over her, like sunlight after a storm. It was as if heaven itself had spoken her name, and in doing so, reminded her who she truly was. It came not as light, not as sound, but as peace, deep and real, the kind that could quiet every fear, every question, every ache that had kept her awake at night. Mary sat in silence, her breathing slow, her heart strangely steady. The walls around her seemed softer somehow, the shadows less dark. The same house that once felt like a prison of memories now felt like a sanctuary. She didn't see him, yet she felt him, the nearness of something eternal. She knew without needing proof. Jesus was there. And in that stillness, every thought that had tormented her seemed to fade, her feelings of failure, of being forgotten, of unworthiness. It was as though someone was gently lifting each burden from her shoulders one by one, replacing them with peace. Her lips trembled, but she managed to whisper, "Why me, Lord?" And though there were no words in answer, the silence itself seemed to speak, "Because I never stopped loving you." Her tears came again, this time from gratitude, not grief. She didn't know if she was dreaming or awake. The boundary between heaven and earth had blurred. Somewhere between her thoughts, she felt his voice again, not heard, but known. "You are mine." The words rippled through her like music, steady, tender, alive. They carried no demand, no reproach, no pity, only belonging. She covered her face with trembling hands and wept quietly. All her life she had given love freely, to children who no longer called, to a husband long gone, to neighbors who had forgotten her name. And now, at last, that love returned, multiplied, perfected, unconditional. The phrase repeated inside her, "You are mine." Each time it came, something in her heart healed. Every rejection, every lonely night, every silent prayer found its answer in that single truth. And for the first time, she didn't feel like someone's forgotten mother. She felt like someone's beloved child. The night grew quiet again, but the peace did not leave. It lingered in her chest, gentle and sure, like a steady flame that refused to fade. Mary sat in her chair, watching the shadows move softly along the wall. She didn't need light now, she felt it inside her. It wasn't a vision or a miracle she could explain. It was remembrance. Her soul had remembered its first love, its first home. She realized that Jesus had always been near, through the lonely meals, the sleepless nights, the unanswered prayers. He had been the silence that stayed, the breath that never left her side. And as she whispered softly into the air, "You never left me, did you?" She felt warmth rise within her once more. No sound answered, but peace itself was the reply. In that moment, she no longer felt like an old woman waiting for visits that never came. She felt like a daughter, seen, held and loved by the one who had called her name since before she was born. Her loneliness had not disappeared. It had been transformed into communion. The house was still quiet, but now it was holy ground. For years, Mary's tears had been born of loss, the kind that burned quietly, leaving her eyes sore and her heart hollow. But that night, when her body could no longer hold the weight of what she had felt, she began to cry in a way she never had before. These tears were warm, alive, flowing not from pain, but from freedom. Each drop carried a memory, a wound, a word she had never said. Every sob seemed to wash something old away. She cried for her children, for her husband, for the years she had spent feeling unseen. But more than anything, she cried because she realized she had been seen all along. Her body trembled with release. Her shoulders shook, but her heart rested. It was as if the tears themselves had been waiting for this moment, to finally fall not into emptiness, but into the hands of one who caught them all. When at last she grew quiet, her breath came slow and easy. The heaviness inside her chest had lifted. Her face was wet, her eyes red. Yet she smiled softly, whispering through the silence, "You found me, Lord." And in the quiet that followed, she felt as though heaven smiled back. Morning came softly. A pale light crept across the floorboards, tracing the edges of her small table, her chair, her Bible. Mary opened her eyes, half expecting the feeling of loneliness to return, but it didn't. Instead, there was warmth, not just in the room, but in her soul. It was the same peace that had filled her during the night, but now it glowed brighter, as if love itself had decided to stay. She stood slowly, feeling the familiar ache in her knees, but even that pain felt lighter, somehow smaller beneath the weight of grace. She looked around her house and saw it differently, not as a place of absence, but as a space where love had chosen to dwell. She made tea, her movements unhurried, her heart quietly humming. Every small action, the boiling of water, the stirring of sugar, the lifting of her cup, felt like an act of worship. There was no need for words, no need to beg or to question anymore. She simply knew. The one who had called her name had never left, and his love filled every corner of her home like sunlight that never dimmed. The world outside woke gently, birds singing from distant branches, the faint hum of life returning to the street. Mary stood by her window, looking out at the sky streaked with shades of gold and rose. For the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of the day. The same walls that had held her grief now felt alive with quiet joy. Even the shadows on the floor seemed tender, softened, redeemed by light. She opened the window, letting the cool air brush her face. It smelled of earth and morning dew, of renewal. Her heart swelled. She didn't need a miracle she could prove. The miracle was this: peace, after so many years of silence. Her Bible still lay open on her nightstand. She hadn't turned the page. She didn't need to. The verse before her eyes was enough. "I have called you by name. You are mine." Her lips trembled as she whispered it aloud, tasting each word like a promise she had long forgotten was hers. That afternoon, Mary took out her old stationery set. Yellowed paper, edges curled by time. Her handwriting was slow but steady as she began to write. "Dear ones," she started, her heart calm, "if this letter ever reaches you, I want you to know I love you, always have, always will." Her words came gently without reproach. She didn't mention the empty years or the visits that never came. Instead, she wrote of small things: her garden blooming again, the quiet joy of watching the sunrise, the peace that had filled her nights. Then, near the end, she added, "You don't have to worry about me anymore. Jesus has called my name, and I am not alone." When she finished, she folded the paper neatly and placed it inside a drawer. She didn't need to send it. Somehow, she knew the message had already been carried to the hearts it was meant for. That night, she sat by the same window, the same silence surrounding her, but it no longer hurt. It simply waited, full of grace. It began unexpectedly, with a knock on the door one Sunday afternoon. Mary hesitated before opening it, her heart unsure whether to believe what she hoped. When she turned the knob, her youngest daughter Sarah stood there. Her eyes were red, her voice soft. "Hi, Mum." Mary didn't speak at first. She only reached forward and gathered her daughter into her arms. No questions, no hesitation, no blame. Just the long, trembling embrace of a love that had been waiting far too long. Over the following weeks, the others came too. Daniel drove in from the city, quiet and apologetic. Michael brought his children, nervous at first, unsure of how to bridge the years of distance. But when they saw their mother smile, they felt something shift inside them, something gentle and unexplainable. They said they didn't know why they had all decided to come. "I just felt like I needed to see you," each of them said, almost word for word. Mary only nodded, her heart understanding what they couldn't. The same voice that had called her name was now calling theirs. And for the first time in a long time, her house was filled with laughter again, not loud or careless, but soft and true, like the sound of Grace returning home. That night, after her children had gone, Mary sat by the table, her hands resting on a cup of cooling tea. The echo of their voices still lingered in the air. Her heart was full, not of triumph, but of peace. She didn't replay their words or measure their gestures. She didn't need to. They had come back, not to fix the past, but to be near again. That was enough. She whispered a quiet prayer. "Lord, thank you for bringing them home." Then, after a pause, she added, "And thank you for helping me forgive before they arrived." She realized forgiveness had come long before reconciliation. It had been born the moment Jesus called her name, the moment she remembered who she was and whose she was. Forgiveness had set her free from waiting, from bitterness, from the endless ache of wanting things to be different. It allowed her to love without condition again. The same love that once raised her children now flowed through her like light. Her eyes filled with tears, not from sorrow but from gratitude. She had lost nothing after all. In love, nothing is ever truly lost, only waiting to be redeemed. As the days turned to weeks, Mary began to feel her body weaken again. Age, after all, is gentle but unstoppable, yet this time she was not afraid. Every morning she woke to the same quiet joy, that sense of being seen, known, and loved. When she prayed, she no longer begged for company or healing. She simply whispered, "I'm listening, Lord." And sometimes in the quiet after prayer, she would feel it again. That same voice from months before, calling softly in her soul, "Mary." It was not a command or a summons. It was a promise. A reminder that when her final day came, she would not walk into darkness. She would be called into light. Each day, she prepared her heart a little more, not with fear, but with calm expectation. She knew where she was going, and even more, she knew who would be waiting. Her faith had grown gentle, like her hands, aged, worn, but strong enough to hold eternity. The evening was quiet, no sound but the soft rustle of the curtains and the ticking of her old clock. Mary sat by the window one last time, the same spot where she had once waited for her children, for answers, for love. She looked out at the darkening sky, the stars blooming slowly above her town. Her heart was steady, her breath peaceful. The same peace that had entered her home months ago now filled her completely. Her Bible lay open beside her, its pages worn and beloved. She placed a trembling hand on it and smiled. "I'm ready, Lord," she whispered. "You called me once before. I'm ready to come when you call again." And as her eyes closed, she felt the warmth once more, that same sacred touch that had comforted her before, now wrapping around her like the gentlest of arms. The ticking clock continued, but time no longer mattered. Her heart had found its rest, not in reunion, not in resolution, but in belonging, in that holy stillness. Mary's final breath became a whisper, "I am yours, Jesus." And heaven answered with silence, the kind of silence that is full of presence.